Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection, and today I want to share my thoughts on another children's book by J.R.R. Tolkien. I've done a few of those in recent months. This one is called Mr. Bliss. This is one that I think a lot of people, even Tolkien fans, are probably not familiar with. I was certainly not familiar with it, but my wife picked up this book, I think last year, and so after we read through Letters from Father Christmas, which we really loved from Tolkien, we wanted to read through this little book. So this book has been recently republished. It was originally published back in 1982, but its history actually goes back far before that. So again, just to remind you, J.R.R. Tolkien, who has become so well known for his Lord of the Rings books and the mythology surrounding that, was his day job was he was a professor at Oxford University, but he loved to write stories for his kids, to tell them interesting tales, and you can just see his creativity and his world building just kind of oozing out of him every opportunity he has. And so he wrote a number of stories for his own kids. In fact, there's a volume that I'm planning on reading next with my girls called Tales from the Perilous Realm, which have some of those stories that he wrote for his own kids, like Roverandom and things like that. Those are somewhat well known. But he also wrote what I recently did a review of, his Letters from Father Christmas. Every year for about 20 years, he would write a letter from Father Christmas to his kids, and he illustrated it and had kind of running characters and things like that. But another of those stories is this little book, Mr. Bliss. And Tolkien actually submitted this to his publisher back in 1936. The Hobbit had just recently come out. It was a success, so they were kind of looking for a successor to The Hobbit. And so he thought this book might be something that would kind of fit that bill. And it's very much a children's book. In fact, it's a different kind of Tolkien book. It doesn't feel like anything else I've read from him. You get a lot more of his humor. It's much more kind of slapstick. It's much more geared towards children. It's a very different Tolkien than like the Silmarillion or even The Hobbit. But it's a really interesting little story, and my girls were at an age where they really were able to enjoy it. So the main character in the story is this gentleman, Mr. Bliss. And he's a quirky, eccentric character, lives in this big house up on the hill. He always wears these tall hats, and he has this strange pet of sorts that lives on his property called the Gear Rabbit, which is kind of like a giraffe and a rabbit. Super tall creature with a big neck, but it behaves somewhat like a rabbit and talks to him and things like that. But the adventure begins when Mr. Bliss decides to buy a yellow motor car, and he goes on this journey. He meets some friends. He runs into some trouble with some different bears. He ends up managing to get everybody kind of mad at him, and they all come chasing back to his house. And it's all kind of this, again, comedy of errors and slapstick humor. Tolkien mixes in a good bit of wordplay and puns and things because, you can't get the linguist out of him. But the whole story kind of just tells the adventure or the misadventures of this character, Mr. Bliss, and his motor car and all the things that went wrong. It's not a serious tale. I don't think it's dealing with larger themes. It's not really tied in any way to his like Middle-earth mythology or legendarium or anything like that. So I talked about how in his Letters from Father Christmas, they're letters from Santa Claus to his kids, and yet he still manages to work in goblins and elvish language, and there's kind of these soft connections between what he's doing in those letters to his kids and what he was doing in his kind of broader work. Mr. Bliss doesn't really have much of any of that. However, it's a really interesting book. It's interesting if you are a Tolkien fan to just sort of see him leaning into, I'm writing a kid's book kind of thing, and to see his humor and his sense of style. The illustrations, by the way, are all done by Tolkien as well. So if you're interested in Tolkien as an artist, because he illustrated a number of his books and was constantly doodling and drawing and things like that, then you get to see some interesting examples of that here as well. But I think the people who will enjoy this book the most are the people to whom it was written, which are really young children. So I would say sort of under 8 years old are going to find this really funny. My kids had several moments where they're literally laughing out loud at just the silliness and the ridiculousness of all the things that are happening and how the characters are behaving and things like that. So it's an interesting little book. Again, I think it's fun to read if you've got little kids. If you don't, you'll probably be a little surprised, maybe disappointed by this book, because if you're coming in expecting Tolkien and you get something that feels very different, you might not quite know what to do with that. And when you look at like the reviews of this book on, Goodreads or Amazon, you'll see a bit of that divide. Some people can just sort of take it as what it is, a fun, silly tale of misadventure for kids, and other people are like, this isn't as good as Tolkien's other works. Well, it's not trying to do it all the same thing, so I don't think it's really fair to compare this to the Silmarillion or something like that. But if you can take it for what it is, it's a fun little book. And this edition is an interesting one. So this actually looks like a bigger book than it is. The whole story is actually about 80 pages. So this is the actual story, because what this edition has done, so this was published in 2011, and it's kind of a reprint of the 1982 edition. So when they published it in 1982, they basically published it the way that Tolkien had put it together, where he has, the pictures, and it's basically a facsimile. So you can see here his illustrations, and then in his handwriting, the text of the story, and then they printed that text above the page. So it's kind of on this horizontal orientation. But at the back of the book, they have basically a reprint of that 1982 edition. So this is kind of a similar style in some ways to like the Letters from Father Christmas edition that I showed in my recent review, where they give you both, the handwritten facsimile of what Tolkien actually wrote, and then the text of what he had written as well. So you have that 1982 edition, but what they did in the 2011 was to not only give you that in the back, but then to also sort of create the book that Tolkien had hoped to create, which was something that would integrate his illustrations with the text. So there's a brief introduction in the front, just kind of giving some of the background and history, and then the story really unfolds, and it has much more of the standard kind of look and feel of a children's book, where his illustrations are just kind of part and parcel with the text. So you can kind of get a sense of that there. It's a very well-made book. This edition has a nice hardcover case. It's a good size book, and it's a fun one. So if you want something a little bit different from a familiar author, I'd recommend Mr. Bliss by J.R.R. Tolkien.